The day Lucy Keating stepped off the wagon and onto the sun-cracked dirt of the Blackwell ranch. The entire population of Millhaven, Texas, stopped what they were doing and stared, because no one in that dusty little town had ever seen a woman arrive with nothing but a single leather satchel, eyes like dark amber glass, and not a single word of English on her tongue. It was the late summer of 1874, and the plains of West Texas were baking under a sun that showed no mercy to anything living beneath it. The grass had gone yellow and brittle in the fields, and the Blackwell cattle lowed mournfully in their pens as if they, too, felt the weight of something about to change. Ezekiel Blackwell was repairing a broken fence post along the eastern edge of his property when he heard the hired hand, a wiry older man named Hector, shouting from the direction of the main road. "Boss, boss, you best come see this." Ezekiel drove the post hammer into the soft earth one final time, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and straightened to his full height. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the heat and brown eyes that held a permanent squint from years of reading the horizon. He was not the kind of man who moved quickly toward commotion. He preferred to approach things the way he approached a skittish horse, slowly, calmly, giving whatever it was time to settle before he got too close. But when he rounded the corner of the barn and saw the woman standing in the yard, he stopped walking entirely. She was standing very still beside Hector, who was gesturing wildly and speaking in the rapid, slightly panicked way he always did when something confused him. The woman appeared to be about 23 or 24, with dark brown hair that had been pinned neatly under a small cloth cap, but was now escaping in pieces around her face from the long journey. She wore a dress that was practical but clearly made in a fashion Ezekiel had never seen before, the collar higher and more ornate, the fabric a deep green that was already dusty from the road. She stood with her spine very straight, her chin level, her amber eyes moving calmly across the unfamiliar landscape as if she were cataloging every detail of it. She was not frightened, Ezekiel realized. That was the first thing that struck him. Most people who arrived at a strange place alone and without the means to communicate showed fear on their faces. This woman showed curiosity. "What in the world?" Ezekiel said, more to himself than to anyone else. Hector turned to him with visible relief. "She came in on Garrett's supply wagon. Garrett says she was waiting at the junction near Abilene, says she had a letter." "A letter? In your name, boss, but it ain't in English." Ezekiel crossed the yard to where the woman stood. When he got close enough, she looked at him directly without flinching and held out a folded piece of paper. Her hand was steady. He took the letter and opened it. The language was one he had seen before, though he could not read it. The script was rounded and slightly slanted, with characters that looped in a way that reminded him of the letters his neighbor Andre had received from his family in Romania. He turned the letter over looking for anything in English and found a single line written in a different hand on the back, clearly added by someone else at some point along the journey. It read, "Her name is Lucy Keating. She is the niece of your former business partner, Joseph Keating. She has nowhere to go. Please help her." Ezekiel stood very still for a moment, reading those 4 sentences 3 times over. Joseph Keating had been his father's partner, a man who had helped establish the Blackwell ranch in its early years, and who had later moved his family to Romania to be near his wife's relatives. Joseph had died 2 winters ago. Ezekiel had received a letter about it, a letter in English that had arrived with a small sum of money that Joseph had apparently set aside as repayment of an old debt. Ezekiel had never met Joseph's family. He had not known there was a niece. He looked up from the letter and found the woman, Lucy, still watching him with those steady amber eyes. "Lucy Keating," he said, trying the name slowly as if testing whether it fit her. Something shifted in her expression at the sound of her own name. A tiny relaxation around the eyes, the faintest breath of recognition and relief. Duh, she said softly and then caught herself and then said it again anyway because apparently she decided that one clear word was better than silence. Duh. He did not know much Romanian. He knew that word from hearing Andrei use it. Yes. Yes, he said. All right. He looked at Hector, who was watching him with the expression of a man waiting to be told what to do. Get her some water, Ezekiel said, and something to eat, and then get Andrei. Andrei Vassal was not exactly a neighbor in any conventional sense. He lived on a small plot of land about 4 miles to the north, where he kept goats and grew a struggling vegetable garden that somehow managed to survive the Texas heat through some combination of careful irrigation and sheer stubbornness. He had come to Texas from Romania 12 years prior, following some complicated chain of events that Andrei had never fully explained to anyone. He spoke English well enough now, though he still mixed his grammatical structures in ways that occasionally confused people, and he retained his Romanian with the fierce devotion of a man who had decided that language was the one thing he would not let this country take from him. He arrived at the Blackwell ranch late that afternoon, dusty from the road, and immediately focused on Lucy with an expression of startled recognition, not of her personally, but of her in the way that people from the same place recognize each other across the wide foreign spaces of elsewhere. Lucy heard him greet her in Romanian, and something in her entire body changed. Her shoulders came down from where they had been held, her jaw unlocked, and she spoke in a rushing, grateful flood of words that told Ezekiel, even without understanding a syllable, that she had been holding a great deal inside for a very long time. Andrei listened, nodded, asked a few brief questions, and then turned to Ezekiel. She says her parents died last winter, he translated, his voice careful and factual, giving the information the same weight that Lucy had given it, which was the weight of something already absorbed, already made peace with. Her uncle Joseph had written to her family before he died and left instructions that she should come to Texas if anything happened. She traveled from Bucharest to Hamburg, and from Hamburg she took a ship to New York, and from New York she came by rail and then by wagon. It took her nearly 4 months. Ezekiel absorbed this. 4 months, he said. She says she is not asking for charity. She says she will work for her keep. Ezekiel looked at Lucy, who was watching Andrei as he translated, her expression attentive and slightly tense, waiting for a reaction. Tell her she is welcome here, Ezekiel said. Tell her she can stay in the spare room in the main house, and she can help with the household work if she wants to, but she doesn't owe me anything. She's Joseph's family. That's enough. Andrei relayed this. Lucy listened, and then she blinked once, twice, and pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was preventing something from showing on her face. She said one thing quietly in Romanian. Andrei smiled. She says thank you, but she means it more than that word usually means. Ezekiel nodded, and because he did not know what else to do, he said, tell her dinner's at 6. Lucy Keating moved into the spare room at the end of the main hallway, a small room with a window that looked out toward the eastern plain and a wooden bed frame with a mattress stuffed with cotton batting. Ezekiel carried in an extra blanket from the cedar chest in the hallway, because even though the days were burning hot, the nights in Texas could turn cool with a speed that surprised people new to the place. She unpacked her satchel with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make any space habitable, arranging a small cloth-wrapped icon on the windowsill, placing a worn book on the nightstand, hanging 2 additional dresses on the pegs behind the door. The dresses, like the one she wore, were well-made but well-used, the seams reinforced multiple times over with careful, experienced stitching. That first dinner was a remarkable exercise in silence and careful attention. Ezekiel's housekeeper, a Mexican woman in her 50s named Rosa, had prepared beef stew with cornbread, and Rosa watched Lucy with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who had seen many things come through this kitchen, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. Rosa spoke English and Spanish, and not a word of Romanian, but she communicated what needed communicating by the simple means of putting food in front of Lucy and gesturing for her to eat. Lucy ate with good appetite and genuine appreciation, the kind of appreciation that came from having been hungry enough often enough to know that a full plate was not to be taken for granted. Ezekiel sat at the head of the table and ate, and tried not to stare at Lucy too obviously, which was a task that required considerably more effort than he would have preferred to admit. He found himself watching the way her hands moved, the way she tilted her head when she was processing something, the way she occasionally glanced around the room and took in some detail and tucked it away somewhere behind her eyes. "Do you know," he said at one point, speaking to no one in particular, because there was no one at the table who would have understood him addressing Lucy directly, "what Romanian sounds like to someone who doesn't speak it?" Rosa looked at him from across the table. "Like music they haven't learned yet," she said in her accented English, and went back to eating. Lucy looked between the two of them, aware she was being discussed, curious but not anxious about it. Ezekiel decided, sitting there in the warm lamplight of his dining room with the sound of his cattle settling into their night sounds outside, that he was going to learn a few words, not because he had any grand scheme in mind, simply because it seemed like the only decent thing to do. The following morning, he found Andre's house before the sun had fully risen and knocked on the door. Andre answered in his nightshirt, holding a lamp, squinting. "What is burning?" "Nothing is burning." "I need you to teach me some Romanian." Andre lowered the lamp and considered him for a long moment. "How much Romanian?" "Start with the basics." "The basics," Andre repeated, as if this were a complicated philosophical concept. "Come inside, then." Andre spent 2 hours with him that morning over black coffee, writing words in a small notebook that Ezekiel had brought. He wrote the words phonetically alongside their Romanian spelling, because the pronunciation of Romanian was something that did not immediately make sense to an English-speaking mouth. Andre was patient, making Ezekiel repeat things until they sounded at least approximately correct, and occasionally laughing when they did not. Ezekiel learned Bună dimineața, which was good morning, Mulțumesc, which was thank you, Te rog, which was please, Mă numesc Ezekiel, which was my name is Ezekiel, Cum te simți, which was how are you feeling, Ai nevoie de ceva, which was do you need anything. He rode back to the ranch with his notebook in his coat pocket, saying the words quietly to himself as he went, feeling the shape of them in his mouth. He found Lucy in the kitchen with Rosa, apparently engaged in a quiet negotiation about the morning chores. Rosa was pointing at things and naming them in Spanish, and Lucy was watching with the focused attention of someone actively memorizing. When Ezekiel came through the back door, both women looked up. He took a breath. He said carefully and with his accent almost certainly destroying at least half of it, "Bună dimineața." Lucy stared at him. Rosa raised an eyebrow. Lucy said very slowly, as if she were not certain she had heard correctly, "Bună dimineața." It was a mirror, an echo. Her saying his words back to him with perfect pronunciation, the way a teacher confirms a student has gotten something right. He felt something happen in his chest that he was not going to examine too closely at 7 in the morning. "Good morning," he said in English, pointing at himself, then at her. "That means good morning." Lucy looked at where he had pointed at himself and pointed at himself the same way, a questioning gesture, and said something in Romanian. "She's asking you to say the English first," Rosa interpreted, which was a guess, but apparently a correct one, because Lucy nodded when Ezekiel said, "Good morning," and then repeated it back with careful attention to each sound. "Good," he said, and then realized he was grinning like an idiot, and tried to compose his face into something more dignified. This was how it began. It was not a formal arrangement. It was not anything with a name. It was simply that every morning Ezekiel came in from his early chores and Lucy was in some part of the house or the yard, and they would stand near each other for a little while and exchange words. He would give her an English word, speaking it slowly and clearly, pointing at the thing or miming the action if it helped. She would say it back. Then she would give him the Romanian equivalent. He would say it back. She would correct his pronunciation with a small gesture of her hand, a slight tilt of the palm, and he would try again. Andre came twice a week and served as a real translator for anything that needed actual communication, explaining the rules of the ranch to Lucy, helping her understand the rhythms of the household, answering her questions about the surrounding country. He also helped Ezekiel build his vocabulary more quickly by giving him longer phrases and more complex constructions to practice. But it was the daily morning exchanges, just the two of them, that Ezekiel found himself looking forward to with an intensity that he recognized even then was disproportionate to what the situation called for. Lucy, for her part, was not idle. She was one of the most relentlessly capable people Ezekiel had ever encountered, and he had grown up around practical, hardworking people. Within her first week on the ranch, she had reorganized the kitchen storage in a way that made Rosa grudgingly admit was more efficient, had repaired 3 pieces of clothing that had been sitting in a basket waiting for someone to get around to mending them, and had learned the feeding schedule for the chickens entirely by watching it done once, and then simply doing it the next day without being asked. She also, he noticed, spent a great deal of time looking at things. Not in an idle, distracted way, but with that same cataloging attention he had observed when she first arrived. She would stand at the fence in the evening and watch the cattle, really watch them, the way they moved and grouped and communicated with each other. She would look at the sky for long minutes at a time, reading the clouds the way he had learned to read them, watching for weather. She watched the land itself with something that was part curiosity and part wonder, because West Texas was nothing like the European landscape she had grown up in, and he understood that she was learning it the same way she was learning English, by sustained, careful attention. One evening toward the end of her second week, he found her standing at the eastern fence at dusk, watching the sun go down behind the opposite horizon in a long purple and orange dissolution. He stood beside her, because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and they watched together in silence for a while. Then she said something in Romanian, soft and reflective, the tone of someone giving voice to a thought rather than expecting a response. He did not understand all of it. He caught the word frumos, which Andre had taught him meant beautiful, and the word dar, which meant but. And he thought he caught a sound that might have been the Romanian word for strange, though he was not certain. Beautiful but strange, he said, translating the pieces he had caught. She looked at him with genuine surprise, and then a slow smile broke across her face, genuine and warm and unguarded in a way that her expressions rarely were during the day when she was concentrating on navigating everything unfamiliar. Duh, she said. Duh, beautiful, but strange. She pronounced each English word with enormous care. Like this, she gestured at the whole landscape, like everything here. For me too, he said, which was not entirely accurate in a geographical sense, since he had grown up in Texas, and this land was as familiar to him as his own hands. But he meant something else by it, and from the way she looked at him, he thought she understood that. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that Ezekiel found himself trying not to love too obviously. September came and brought a slight cooling in the air, a merciful thinning of the suffocating summer heat, and the ranch entered its busy autumn season with cattle drives to organize and winter supplies to stock and fences to reinforce before the cold months. Lucy threw herself into the work of the ranch with a dedication that earned her Rose's complete and unequivocal approval, which was not an easy thing to earn. She learned the Spanish word for flower and the English word for fire, and the name of every horse in the stable, which she asked Ezekiel to teach her one by one, taking the time to let each horse smell her hand before she repeated its name. She learned that the gray mare was called Silver, and the black gelding was called Coal, and the bay stallion that Ezekiel rode most days was called Reckoning, which she found difficult to pronounce and called instead Beckon, which Ezekiel decided he liked better anyway. She also helped with the cattle drives that September, which surprised Hector enormously and delighted him once he got over the surprise. She could not rope and had no experience with cattle in any meaningful sense, but she could ride, having learned on horses in Romania that were smaller and less opinionated than Texas ranch horses, and she adapted to Beckon's habits within 2 days of her first real ride. She was useful at the back of the herd, preventing stragglers from falling behind, which required patience and steady riding more than any particular skill, and she was apparently inexhaustible. "Where did you find her?" Hector asked Ezekiel one afternoon, watching Lucy guide a straggling heifer back toward the main group with calm efficiency. "She found us," Ezekiel said. Their language lessons had grown into something considerably more complex and interesting as October approached. They had moved well beyond pointing at objects and naming them. They had developed a makeshift system of teaching grammar through example, where one of them would construct a sentence and the other would attempt to reconstruct its equivalent. It was imperfect and often hilarious, producing sentences that were technically grammatical but contextually bizarre, and they had fallen into the habit of laughing at the strange things they managed to communicate and miscommunicate. Lucy's English was growing with impressive speed. She had a natural ear for language, an ability to hear rhythms and patterns and reproduce them, and she was completely unself-conscious about making mistakes, which allowed her to practice constantly without the paralysis of embarrassment. By mid-October, she could manage whole conversations in English, halting and imperfect and endearingly earnest, but real conversations about real things. Ezekiel's Romanian was slower going. It was a more complex language in certain ways, with grammatical cases and gender agreements, and a collection of sounds that his English-trained mouth kept sliding away from. But he was stubborn in the way that men who have spent their lives working hard land are stubborn, and he kept at it every morning with the same methodical persistence he applied to everything else on the ranch. One morning in the second week of October, Andre came by for his usual visit and found Ezekiel and Lucy in the middle of an animated exchange in the kitchen, half in English and half in Romanian, with occasional Spanish words inserted by Rosa from across the room, the whole conversation moving with a speed and ease that made Andre stop in the doorway and watch with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something like emotion. "You do not need me anymore," he said, when they noticed him. "We absolutely still need you," Ezekiel said, "but maybe a little less for the translating." Andre sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Rosa poured for him without being asked, and said to Lucy, in Romanian, something that Ezekiel was able to follow only partially. Lucy answered in Romanian, also partially decipherable to Ezekiel, but he caught enough to understand that Andre had asked her how she was finding life here, and she had said something about finding it better than she had expected and harder than she had imagined, and full of things she had not known she needed. He did not ask her to translate that. It felt like something she had said to Andre specifically, because Andre would understand it in the way that only someone from the same place could, and Ezekiel respected that. But he thought about it for the rest of the day. The social geography of Millhaven was something Lucy navigated with the same careful attention she applied to everything else. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and her arrival had naturally been the subject of considerable discussion. There were people who were curious and friendly, and there were people who were less so, because 1874 in West Texas was not a place that universally welcomed difference. The first time Ezekiel took Lucy into town for supplies, he watched her encounter the full range of Millhaven's population in one afternoon. The woman who ran the dry goods store, a cheerful widow named Mrs. Hargrove, greeted Lucy with unconditional warmth and attempted to teach her the name of every single item in her store in the space of 15 minutes. The men at the feed supply were politely neutral. The group of wives assembled outside the church regarded her with the complex expression of women trying to decide whether to feel charitable or suspicious. And Ezekiel intercepted that situation by introducing Lucy formally and speaking about Joseph Keating in terms that connected her to a name they all knew and generally respected, which shifted the balance toward charity. But there was one moment, near the saloon on the main street, when a man Ezekiel knew only vaguely, a drifter who passed through Millhaven irregularly, made a comment in Lucy's direction that was low and unkind, and had to do with foreigners taking what wasn't theirs. Ezekiel went very still in the way he went still before something needed to be handled, and he turned toward the man with a look that apparently communicated everything necessary without a single word being said, because the man suddenly found something interesting to look at in the opposite direction. Lucy had heard the comment. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone, which was universal. She said nothing, her chin level, her eyes steady. When they continued walking, she said to Ezekiel in her careful, increasingly confident English, "It is the same everywhere, different words, same sound." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. You did not do it." "No." "But I'm still sorry you have to hear it." She glanced at him. "You did not let him keep saying it." "No," he said. "I didn't." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply, "Good." November arrived with a north wind that swept down from the panhandle and brought the serious cold. The grass went brown and brittle, the water troughs developed thin skins of ice in the mornings, and the household shifted its rhythms toward winter. Ezekiel ordered extra feed for the cattle, had the stable roof reinforced where it had weakened over the summer, and stocked the woodshed with enough split logs to last through February. Lucy took to the autumn preparations with her characteristic energy, and she and Rosa developed a partnership in the kitchen that produced quantities of preserved food, jars of pickled vegetables and dried fruit and salt-cured meat, that stacked the pantry floor to ceiling. Ezekiel came in from a long afternoon of fence work one day in early November to find the kitchen warm and fragrant, and Lucy and Rosa talking to each other in a mixture of Romanian and Spanish and English that should not have worked as a communication medium, but clearly did, because they were both laughing about something. He stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment, the lamplight warm on Lucy's face, her hair escaping from its pins the way it always did by late afternoon, her hands moving over the work in front of her, with the particular grace of someone who had done this kind of thing so many times that it had become part of the body's knowledge rather than the mind's. Something happened to him standing there. Something that had been building for weeks with the slow, accumulating weight of water finding its level, and he recognized it finally and clearly for what it was. He was in love with her. Not in the complicated, uncertain way that such things sometimes crept up on people, but in the clear, unambiguous way that certain truths present themselves when you finally stop looking sideways at them and let them be what they are. He went to put his coat away and to think. He spent several days thinking. He was not a man given to impulsive action, and this particular circumstance seemed to him to require more than his usual careful deliberation. Lucy was in his house because she had nowhere else to go, because she was Joseph Keating's niece, and she had arrived without resources and without language, and he had taken her in. There was a very real possibility that any gesture on his part would feel to her like a form of pressure, like something she could not refuse because of the position she was in. This concern was real, and he sat with it seriously, turning it over, examining it from multiple angles over the course of several evenings spent on the porch in the cold, with his coffee going cold in his hand. What resolved the question for him was something he had noticed over the past weeks, which was that Lucy Keating was not a woman who did things she did not want to do out of gratitude or obligation. She had a quiet, iron backbone that he had come to recognize and deeply respect. She had declined things she did not need, refused help she did not want, corrected him when he was wrong, disagreed with him when she disagreed, and expressed her own preferences about things with a directness that was entirely unaffected by her precarious position. She was not performing the role of the grateful ward. She was being herself, completely and without apology. If she was not interested in him, she would tell him. He was certain of that. The moment came, as moments often do, not when he had planned it, but when it arrived of its own accord. It was a mid-November evening, the sky showing its first real winter darkness, hard and clear and full of stars. He had found Lucy standing at the eastern fence again, in what had become something like her habitual watching place, looking out at the dark plain under the enormous sky. She wore a heavy wool shawl over her dress, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. He came to stand beside her, close enough that the cold created a reason to stand near another person without it needing to mean anything. They stood in silence for a while, which was something they had grown comfortable with, silence being its own kind of language between people who had spent so long finding words together. Then Lucy said in English, which she now used with him as their primary shared language, her accent still there and probably always would be, but no longer a barrier to anything. "When I was on the ship from Hamburg, I was very afraid, not of the water, of arriving somewhere and not being able to say anything, like being blind but for words. And now," he said, "now I have words, many more than before." She paused. "And I have." She seemed to be searching for the exact right phrasing. "I have a place, a real place, not only a room in a house, a place." She touched the fence post. "This is my fence, my work is in this fence." His heart turned over. "Lucy," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who found personal declarations easy. He had been raised by a taciturn father on a working ranch where sentiment was expressed through action rather than words, and he had carried that habit into his adult life. But he had spent months learning a new language because this woman deserved to be spoken to in her own tongue, and that same instinct, the one that said language is how you honor someone's presence, was now telling him to use the English words both of them had worked so hard to share. "I have been," he started, and then stopped and started differently. "You came here and I thought I knew what this would be. Someone to help. Someone to take care of for a while because of her uncle, because it was the right thing. And it is the right thing, and I would do it again. But it became something else." He looked at the stars rather than at her because it was easier. "Or I became something else, because of you." The silence that followed lasted long enough that he looked back at her. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, soft and a little raw, like something underneath had been uncovered. "I did not know," she said carefully, "if what I was feeling was because of gratitude. I was afraid of that, of confusing gratitude for something it is not." "I was afraid of that too," he said. "For you, I mean, afraid you might feel obligated to me." She shook her head once definitively. "No, I have thought about this. I know what gratitude is. I know what I feel for you." She looked at him steadily. "It is not the same." "What is it then?" he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, scraped thin by how much the answer mattered. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something in Romanian, a short, simple phrase that was not one he had already learned. "Tell me what that means," he said. "I feel," she said in English slowly, giving each word its full weight, "as if I have been cold for a very long time and I did not know it because I had nothing warm to compare to. And then I came here. And now I know." He had a lot of things he could have said. He was a man who had spent the better part of 4 months learning a new language, so it was not that words escaped him. But what he did instead was something simpler. He reached out and took her hand, the one that had been resting on the fence post, and held it. She did not pull away. She turned her hand under his so that their fingers laced together, and they stood there at the eastern fence under the vast Texas stars, with the cold wind coming down from the north, holding on to each other with the particular grip of people who have found something real and intend to keep it. The winter closed in properly by December, bringing real cold and occasional hard frost, and the particular beauty of the West Texas sky in clear weather, all that enormous blue like the inside of something infinite. The cattle huddled in their winter groups, and the household settled into its slower winter rhythms, with long evenings around the fire and shorter days of outside work. Something had opened between Ezekiel and Lucy in the way that things open after a door is finally walked through. They were still careful with each other, the way people are careful with things that matter, but they were also freer, more willing to be known. He learned things about her that the language barrier had previously made hard to convey, the particular complexity of her journey through a grief-filled year, the stubbornness that had kept her going through 4 months of travel without a common language, the intelligence that she wore lightly, the humor that emerged in the quiet moments between working and sleeping. She laughed easily once she had enough English to find the things funny that actually were funny. She had a dry, quick wit that surprised people who expected someone still learning a language to be literal and simple, and the combination of precise English word choice and a Romanian sense of irony produced observations that made Ezekiel laugh in a way he had not laughed in years. One evening by the fire, he read aloud to her from a book of poetry, translating as he went, and she corrected some of his translations by offering better Romanian equivalents, and they spent an hour arguing pleasantly about how to render the exact feeling of a particular English phrase in Romanian, and whether the two languages had the same word for longing, which turned out to be a genuinely interesting question. They did not rush. There was a rightness in not rushing, in letting what was building between them build at the pace that things that last are supposed to build. He brought her wildflowers from the edge of the property in November when there were still some left, dried and pale but still beautiful. She mended his favorite work coat without being asked, and without saying anything about it, which was her way of doing kindness, quietly and without drama, leaving evidence of care like small gifts to be discovered. Rosa watched all of this with the composed satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting patiently for people to figure out what she could see perfectly well from the beginning, and she said nothing at all about it, which was also its own form of respect. Andre came for dinner one Sunday evening in late November and observed the two of them talking across the table with the easy familiarity of people who have learned each other through sustained and loving attention, and he said to Rosa in Spanish, which he had enough of to manage a simple statement, that he was glad. Rosa agreed. "Very glad," she said, with the tone of someone who has taken some personal credit. The evening that things shifted from the tender and tentative to something more certain arrived in early December, when the first real snow of the season came down from the north in the night and left Millhaven and the surrounding countryside blanketed in a white that changed the entire character of the landscape. Ezekiel woke before dawn, as he always did, and went to the window and saw the snow in the dark, the way it made its own light, turning the world silver and quiet. He heard movement in the hallway, and then Lucy appeared at the end of the corridor, also awake, wearing her heavy shawl over her nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She saw the snow through the window and went immediately to look at it with the same expression she wore when she was learning something, purely attentive, fully present. "Ni," she said softly. "It is the same word in Romanian, almost, Zapata." She turned to look at him. "I did not think it would snow here." "It doesn't always," he said. "Only sometimes, usually not this early." The snow in Romania was different, heavier. It came and stayed for months. She looked back out the window. "This looks light. Like it is only visiting." That's a good way to put it. The silence between them in that early morning was different from any previous silence. It was the silence of two people standing in a small corridor before the rest of the world was awake, with the snow making the darkness softer and closer, and no particular requirement to be anything other than what they were. He said her name, just her name. She turned to look at him again, and whatever was on his face at that moment apparently communicated everything the language lessons had been building toward, because she took one step toward him and he took one step toward her, and the distance became nothing. He kissed her gently, carefully, with the attention of someone who has thought about this moment and wants it to be exactly what it should be. Her hand came up to his jaw, cold from the corridor air, and he felt the faint tremor in it that told him she was feeling what he was feeling, that this mattered equally to her. When they separated, her eyes were open and looking at him, close and clear. "Ezekiel," she said, and she said his name the way she always had, with the Romanian sound softening the middle syllable in a way that no one else in his entire life had ever pronounced his name, and he had privately thought for months that the way she said his name was the finest thing he had ever heard. "I have something to ask you," he said. She waited. He was aware of the timing, of the fact that this was only her 3rd month on the ranch, and that by some measures this was too fast. But he also knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has worked hard land long enough to know which things grow true and which things only look like something from a distance, that this was real. That it was not fast, that in fact it was the right speed for what it was, which was something that had grown steadily and honestly through months of genuine, painstaking effort to know each other. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because you need somewhere to be, and not because I feel responsible for you, because I love you. And I would like you to be here with me, not as a guest, but as my partner, in this house and on this land and in this life." He paused. "But I also want you to know that if you want time, or if the answer is no, then nothing changes. You are welcome here regardless." Lucy looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that had always seemed to him to hold more than they showed, and then she said something in Romanian, soft and clear in the snowy silence of early morning. "Tell me," he said. She switched to English. "I came across the world to a place I did not know, speaking a language no one around me understood because I had nowhere else to go, and I trusted that somewhere at the end of all that distance there was something worth arriving at." She paused. "I did not know it would be you, but it is you. And yes." He took her hands in his. "Yes," she said again firmly, as if it needed to be said twice to be fully real. They were married in February of 1875, in the small church in Millhaven that the Reverend Morris presided over with more enthusiasm than elegance, but with genuine feeling. Andre served as witness and translator for any parts of the ceremony that Lucy wanted explained, though she had, by February, enough English to follow most of it herself. Rosa sat in the front pew and cried, which she would have strongly denied if anyone had mentioned it, which no one did. Mrs. Hargrove from the dry goods store came. Several of the ranching families from the surrounding area came, because Ezekiel Blackwell was a respected figure in the local ranching community, and because people in small towns attend the weddings of people they respect as an act of community as much as a social occasion. Hector came in his best shirt, which he had ironed himself with considerable effort and some scorching. Lucy wore a dress that she and Rosa had worked on together through January, a dark blue wool with a high collar and small white buttons, practical and beautiful in equal measure, which was entirely her. Ezekiel wore his good coat and clean boots, and stood at the front of the church waiting for her with his hands clasped in front of him, and the expression of a man who is trying very hard to look composed and managing it only approximately. When she walked through the door on Andre's arm, because there was no one else in the building who constituted family in the conventional sense, and Ezekiel saw her in the morning light coming through the church windows in that blue dress with her hair pinned up and her chin level, and her amber eyes finding his immediately, he stopped trying to look composed. He had been in this church dozens of times. He had sat in these pews for other people's ceremonies, for funerals and christenings and Sunday services, and the building had always felt to him like a familiar, slightly too warm room with uncomfortable seats. On this particular morning, it felt different. It felt like somewhere something real was happening. The ceremony was simple and honest, and when Reverend Morris asked Ezekiel if he took this woman, Ezekiel said, "I do," with more certainty than he had felt about anything since he was a young man deciding to take over his father's land and make something lasting of it. When Morris asked Lucy, she said, "I do," in clear, deliberate English, and the syllables were weighted with everything they carried, with 4 months of ocean and rail and wagon, with the loss that had set her traveling, with the months of careful, patient work of learning to live in a foreign world. With all the mornings at the eastern fence, and all the evenings by the fire, and all the words exchanged between two people who had decided that no barrier was too large to cross if the thing on the other side was worth crossing for. There was a celebration at the ranch afterward that Rosa and Mrs. Hargrove organized together with competitive efficiency, the result of which was both enormous and delicious. Tables of food set out in the main room of the house with every dish the combined culinary traditions of Texas and Mexico and Romania could produce from the available ingredients. Andrei produced a bottle of something he had been saving for an appropriate occasion and poured it for everyone who wanted it, and the result was an afternoon of warmth and noise and laughter that was exactly what a wedding celebration in a frontier town in 1875 was supposed to be. Lucy stood beside Ezekiel in the middle of all of it, and he watched her move through the conversations with the confidence of a woman who had decided that this was her world now, and she intended to be fully in it. Her English, surrounded by all these English-speaking people, rose to the occasion with a fluency that surprised even him. She laughed at jokes and made a few of her own, with the slight ironic precision that was always her signature, and he watched people fall a little bit in love with her in the uncomplicated way that people fall a little bit in love with a person who is genuinely and openly themselves in a room. Hector gave a toast that was principally an incoherent account of the day Lucy had arrived at the ranch, embellished considerably from reality, but correct in all the ways that mattered, and which ended with him saying that the boss was finally the kind of fool he had always hoped he would be, which was the kind of fool who knows what he has when he has it. Andrei translated this for Lucy's benefit, adding something in Romanian that was probably not a direct translation, because it made her laugh harder than the original had. That evening, when the guests had gone home and Rosa had retired for the night, and the house was quiet except for the fire crackling in the hearth, Ezekiel and Lucy sat together in the large chair by the window that looked east, which was slightly too small for two adults, but sufficiently so for two people who had decided that the small space between them was not a problem but a preference, and they watched the winter sky turn dark and brilliant over the plain. "Tell me something in Romanian," he said. She thought for a moment, and then she said, "Esti acasă me." What does that mean? She was quiet for a moment, the way she always was when she was looking for the English that carried the full weight of the Romanian meaning. "You are my home," she said, "but in Romanian it is a different kind of meaning. It is not the home you go to. It is the home you carry with you, the one that is inside, not outside, the one that stays with you even when you are far from everything you know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Romanian with the pronunciation that she had been patiently correcting for months until it was almost right, "Esti acasă me." She turned to look at him with those amber eyes. "Your accent," she said, "is terrible." "I know," he said. "But the meaning is correct," she said. "Good," he said. She settled against him with the ease of someone who has found the place where they fit, and they watched the winter night together, and neither of them said anything else for a long time because nothing else needed saying. Spring came to the Blackwell ranch in March with the particular violence of Texas spring, hard rain and flash storms, and then sudden, explosive green, the land going from the gray-brown dormancy of winter to full color in what felt like a matter of days. The cattle came through the winter in good condition, and Ezekiel began the spring work with the energy of a man who has spent the winter very happily and is now ready to pour that accumulated well-being into hard work. Lucy was by this time as much a part of the daily running of the ranch as anyone else on the property, and her role had evolved from its early, tentative household contribution into something genuinely integral. She had a particular gift with the horses that had become evident over the winter months, a patience and steadiness that the animals responded to, and she had taken on the management of the stable with Rosa's encouragement, and Ezekiel's admiring acknowledgement that some people simply have a language with animals that cannot be taught. She continued working on her English, not because she needed to, but because she was the kind of person who did not stop learning things she had started. She asked Ezekiel to bring her books from town when he went, and she read in the evenings by the fire with the focused concentration of someone treating reading as a skill to be developed, which it was. She also wrote letters in Romanian to Andrei's family contacts who had connections to Romania, in the hope of tracking down some distant relatives she thought might still be living in the country, because the connections to her history mattered to her, and she intended to maintain them where she could. She also began teaching Ezekiel to write in Romanian, because he had learned to speak a respectable amount of it, but his reading and writing were limited, and she said that a language only half learned was a door only half open. He spent several evenings hunched over the kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to reproduce the script that she wrote with effortless, elegant ease, and producing something that looked, as he himself admitted, like it had been written by a man wearing mittens. She laughed at this without mercy, which he loved. It was in late spring, on a warm May evening with the windows open to the soft night air, and the sound of the cattle settled in their summer pastures, that Lucy told him she was expecting a child. She told him in English, simply and directly, in the way she told him most things that were important. He sat very still for a moment with the information settling into him, feeling the weight and the warmth and the enormity of it. "Are you all right?" he said, because this was his first response to important information about Lucy, always to establish her condition before his own feelings. "Yes," she said. "I am more than all right. I am happy." She looked at him carefully. "Are you?" "Happy," he said, "is not a large enough word." She smiled. He went around the table to where she was sitting and took her hands and held them and looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived at his gate, speaking no English and no language he could reach, with nothing but a letter and a leather satchel and more courage than most people he had ever known. And he thought about all the things that had to happen in exactly the way they happened for this particular evening to exist. And he felt the particular gratitude of a man who knows that chance and stubbornness, and two people's willingness to learn, have made something that neither could have made alone. "Te iubesc," he said, which was the Romanian he had learned early, in that first week of going to Andrei's house before dawn with his notebook, because it was the sentence he knew mattered most, and he had wanted to be able to say it in her language before he said it in his own. She had heard him say it before. They had said it often in both languages in the months since December. But the way she looked at him now, in this particular moment with the night air coming through the window and the knowledge of what was beginning between them, was the way she looked at things she was cataloging, taking something in and storing it in the place where important things live. "Te iubesc," she said back. The summer of 1875 was a full one, filled with the ordinary miraculous labor of running a ranch and building a marriage and preparing for a new life. Ezekiel worked the land with the extra energy of a man who has reasons beyond himself to make things thrive, and the Blackwell ranch had its best cattle season in years, the animals fat and healthy from the good spring grass. Hector observed that the boss had gotten either very lucky or very smart, and that either way the cattle didn't seem to mind. Lucy worked alongside everyone else until her condition required adjustments, and even then she found ways to remain useful, her particular gift with the horses not requiring physical labor so much as presence and attention. She continued her reading and writing, and she began in the summer to attempt to teach Ezekiel things beyond the practical vocabulary, the history and stories of Romania, because she said that a language is not fully understood until you know the stories people tell in it, and she wanted him to know hers. These evenings of storytelling were among the richest of what had become a remarkably rich life. She told him about Romanian folk stories and historical figures and the specific texture of the city she had grown up in, and he listened the way he had always listened to things he wanted to understand, with full attention and occasional questions and the willingness to sit with complexity. He told her, in return, the history of this land, the parts that were his family's and the parts that were larger and harder. He told her about the land itself, how to read its seasons, what the different cloud formations meant, which plants were useful and which were dangerous. He talked about the history of the territory and the displacement of the native peoples who had lived on this land before the ranchers, because it was real and it had happened, and he believed it mattered to say clearly what had happened, even when it was not comfortable. Lucy listened to this with serious attention and asked careful questions and said, at the end of it, that this was the same everywhere in the world, that the stronger always found a reason that the taking was necessary, and that the reason was always false, and he agreed. They were not naive people. They knew what the world was. But they had also found that it was possible to know what the world was and still insist, through daily practice, on making the smaller world around you as just and as kind as it could be. This was not a grand solution, but it was what was available, and they took it seriously. On a clear October evening, with the leaves on the few trees around the ranch turned to their brief autumn colors, and the air sharp and clean, Lucy gave birth to their first child in the bedroom of the Blackwell Ranch's main house, with Rosa serving as the primary support and a doctor who had come out from Millhaven, arriving barely in time to be useful. It was a boy. Ezekiel held his son in the lamplight and felt the specific wordlessness of that moment, the way certain experiences empty all language out of you so that you are left with only the fact of them, simple and enormous. He looked at Lucy, who was exhausted and brilliant-eyed and looking at the baby with the expression of someone discovering a wonder they had prepared for but could not have anticipated. "What shall we call him?" Ezekiel asked. Lucy thought for a moment and then said, "Joseph." "For your father's partner, for the one who sent me to you." He looked at her. "It seems right," she said. "It does," he said. "Joseph." He looked at the baby. "Joseph Blackwell." He tried it in both languages in his head, and it worked in both. Yes. Joseph Blackwell was born into a house that was full, a house where two languages lived together and a third one, Spanish, wandered through the kitchen regularly, and where the people who moved through the rooms had come from different worlds and made something new in the place where those worlds met. He was a healthy, loud, curious baby who shared his mother's habit of watching things with focused, cataloging attention, and his father's habit of approaching new situations with cautious, deliberate calm before deciding how to respond to them. Rosa, who had declared herself completely indifferent to children in general, became so attached to Joseph that she rearranged her entire daily schedule to accommodate the optimal amount of time holding him, and she denied this so strenuously, whenever anyone mentioned it, that it became one of the ranch's established entertainments. Hector became unexpectedly skilled at making the baby laugh. Andre came for dinner one Sunday in November, when Joseph was 3 weeks old, and sat across the table from Ezekiel and Lucy with the baby asleep in the cradle that Ezekiel had made himself from cedar wood over the summer, and said to both of them in both languages alternating, "You know, when you came to my door before sunrise asking me to teach you Romanian, I thought you had been out in the sun too long. And now," Ezekiel said. Andre looked at the room, at Rosa moving around the kitchen, at Lucy with her cup of tea and her loose hair and her comfortable ease in the chair that had become entirely hers, at the baby in the cedar cradle, at the winter light coming through the window. "Now," he said, "I think there was nothing strange about it. People learn what they need to learn to get to where they are supposed to be." Lucy raised her cup toward him, not as a formal toast but as a quiet acknowledgement. "To teachers," she said. "To students who try," Andre said. Ezekiel said nothing, but he reached under the table and found Lucy's hand and held it, the way he had held it that first evening at the fence, with the grip of a man who has found something real and intends to keep it, and she laced her fingers through his in the way she always did, easy and sure. The Blackwell Ranch in the winter of 1875, going into 1876, was a different place from the one that had existed before a wagon pulled up in late summer and put a woman with amber eyes and a single leather satchel into the yard. It was louder, for one thing, not just because of the baby, but because a house that holds people who love each other generates a different kind of sound. Conversations that run long and laughter that comes easily, and the particular comfortable noise of people doing things near each other without needing to explain why. Ezekiel had begun teaching Joseph English and Romanian simultaneously from the beginning, because Lucy had said that a child born into two languages lives in two worlds, and two worlds are better than one. He sang to the baby in English, and she sang to him in Romanian, and the result was a child who would eventually grow up moving between languages with the natural ease of someone who never knew it was supposed to be difficult. But that was all still ahead of them. For now it was winter and the ranch was settled and warm, and the cedar cradle held a sleeping boy, and the fire burned in the hearth, and the two people who had built all of this sat together in their familiar chair by the east-facing window, looking out at the dark plain under the winter stars. Lucy said, "Do you remember the first morning, when you said good morning to me in Romanian?" "Bună dimineața," he said. "Your pronunciation," she said, with the same affectionate precision she always brought to this subject, "was wrong. I know. But I understood what you were trying to do." "What was I trying to do?" he said, not because he did not know, but because he wanted to hear her say it. She considered this with the seriousness she always brought to things that mattered. "You were trying to say that I was not invisible," she said, "that I was a person who deserved to be spoken to in her own language, not a stranger to be managed, a person to be met." She paused. "I had been invisible for a very long time in those 4 months of traveling. I could feel myself disappearing because I could not put words to myself for anyone around me. And then you said that one wrong word in my language and I came back." He was quiet for a moment. "You never looked invisible," he said. "Feeling invisible and looking it are different things," she said. "I was very determined not to look it." "I noticed that too," he said. "That first day, you were not afraid, you just looked at everything." "I was afraid," she said. "I was very afraid, but I have found that looking at things carefully is a better response to fear than showing it." He thought about this. "Bună dimineața," he said again, this time making a deliberate effort at the pronunciation, drawing on months and months of practice. She looked at him, and the smile that crossed her face was the same one that had crossed it the first morning, unguarded and warm, the one that showed up when she was genuinely pleased. "Better," she said. "Still wrong, slightly, but much better." She turned to look out at the winter stars. "You have worked very hard." "So have you," he said. "We both have," she said. Outside, the north wind moved across the plain with a long, quiet sound like the land breathing. The stars were very bright and very numerous, the way they are in places where there is enough dark around them to show their true extent. Joseph made a small sound in his cradle, the sound of a baby dreaming, and then was quiet again. Lucy rested her head against Ezekiel's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that for a long time, in the way that people who are home stay in the place they have made, settled and warm and certain. In the spring of 1877, Lucy tracked down a second cousin in Bucharest through a series of letters that had taken months to exchange across the Atlantic, and learned that the cousin, a young woman named Marta, was in circumstances not entirely unlike the ones Lucy had been in 3 years before. Lucy wrote to Ezekiel about this possibility with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across from him at the dinner table with her letter and her tea. "She has no family left there," Lucy said. "She is capable and strong. I was wondering if perhaps there might be work here, real work, not charity." Ezekiel looked at her across the table. "Is there a man named Andrei Vasil who has been eating dinner here once a week for 3 years, and who I have noticed looking at the corner of the room where you usually sit whenever you're not in it?" he said. Lucy pressed her lips together, which was what she did when she was trying not to smile immediately. "I had noticed that too," she said. "Write to your cousin," he said. Andre, when consulted, turned the color of a sunset and became briefly unable to form a complete sentence, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on managing 3 languages. He recovered his composure within a few minutes and said, with great dignity, that he did not make decisions about people he had not met, which was entirely fair and true, and which Lucy accepted graciously. Marta Ionescu arrived in Millhaven in August of 1877, speaking no English. It was a warm afternoon, and Andre was at the ranch for dinner as he always was on Sundays. And when the wagon came up the main road, and a woman with red hair and green eyes, and a spine like iron stepped down into the dust of the yard and looked around with the particular expression of someone cataloging everything around them, Ezekiel watched Andre Vasil stand up so fast he knocked over his chair. Lucy caught the chair. Ezekiel watched Andre walk across the yard toward the woman with the deliberate, careful pace of a man approaching something that matters, and he watched the woman's eyes land on Andre and stay there with a steadiness that was very familiar to him. He looked at Lucy, who was watching the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction. "You knew," he said. "I hoped," she said. "You knew," he said again. She handed him his coffee. By the time winter came that year, Andre had learned enough English phrases to help Marta, and Marta had begun learning both English and Texas Spanish from Rosa, who had an apparently inexhaustible patience for teaching people the practical language of survival in a foreign place. Andre came to the ranch for dinner 3 times a week now, which no one mentioned but everyone noted. The winter of 1877 brought the deepest snow the region had seen in years, a real snowfall that stayed for 3 weeks and transformed the Texas landscape into something so different from its usual character that it felt like looking at an entirely different country. The cattle were safely wintered, the horses stabled, the woodshed more than full because Ezekiel had spent the fall preparing with the thoroughness of a man who does not like to be caught insufficient. On an evening in December of that winter, Ezekiel and Lucy stood together at the east-facing window that had become their window, the one that looked out over the plain, and watched the snow come down in the lamplight. Joseph, now 2 years old, was asleep in his room, having exhausted himself with the energetic business of being 2. He had, that day, said his first complete sentence in Romanian, which had made Lucy hold him for an extended period that he eventually began to object to. Lucy was expecting again, this time showing clearly, the second baby due in the early spring. She looked out at the snow and said nothing for a while, which was always, with Lucy, a sign of thinking rather than absence. Then she said, "When I was on the wagon from Abilene in that last part of the journey, I tried to imagine what I was going to find. I could not. I had no picture for it." "What did you picture?" he said. "Something functional," she said. "Something that would keep me alive and allow me to be useful. I did not picture more than that." She looked at him. "I could not have pictured more than that. I did not know yet that more was something that could happen." He thought about the version of himself that had been repairing a fence post and heard Hector shouting and gone to sea, expecting some ordinary ranch complication. "Neither did I," he said. She leaned against him in the way she did, easy and familiar and sure, and he put his arm around her and looked out at the snow with her, at the white plain under the dark sky, at the extraordinary ordinary beauty of it. "Bună seara," he said. "Good evening." His pronunciation was good now, genuinely good, worked at over 3 years of daily practice until the sounds had become natural to his mouth. "Bună seara," she said, and in her voice he heard every morning at the fence, every evening by the fire, every word exchanged between 2 people who had decided that difference was not a distance but a world to explore together. Their second child, a girl, was born in April of 1878, on a warm spring morning when the eastern plain was already showing the first green of the season, and they named her Elena, which was a name that worked in both Romanian and in English without losing anything in the translation, which seemed to them exactly right. And the Blackwell Ranch, which had been a capable, well-run but solitary place before August of 1874, was by the spring of 1878 something considerably larger than it had been, not in acres, though it had grown some, but in the richer and less measurable way that places grow when they are inhabited by people who love each other and have built something together through sustained and genuine effort. The mornings there were full. The kitchen was always occupied by early light, Rosa and Lucy working side by side with the comfortable ease of a long partnership, while the sound of Joseph's voice carried from wherever he was in the house, a 2-year-old's constant running commentary on the world. Ezekiel came in from his first chores to find coffee already made and the particular warmth of a household in motion, and he stood in the kitchen doorway as he always had. But now there were 2 children and a wife and a housekeeper and the daily noise of something built. He said, every morning in Romanian, "Bună dimineața." And every morning, Lucy looked up from whatever she was doing and said it back, her pronunciation impeccable, a small smile at the corners of her mouth, the same smile that had crossed her face that very first morning when a man who barely knew 3 words of her language had tried to reach her in it. Andre married Marta the following summer, in the same small church in Millhaven where Ezekiel and Lucy had married, with Lucy and Ezekiel as witnesses, and Rosa crying with the same intensity she had demonstrated at the first wedding, and denying it with the same equal intensity afterward. Hector gave a toast that was, once again, principally incoherent but emotionally accurate. The 2 couples had dinner together every Sunday from that point forward, alternating between the Blackwell Ranch and the Vassal property to the north, and the table was always crowded and always loud, and always in at least 3 languages simultaneously, which the children growing up in those 2 households came to understand as simply how dinner worked. The years after that were the years that make a life, full of the particular texture of sustained happiness, which is not the same thing as constant happiness, because no sustained thing is constant, but is rather the underlying note that remains even through the hard moments, the foundation that holds. There were hard moments, the inevitable ones of ranching life and human life, dry years and sick animals and losses that were real losses. But there was also spring every year, and the cattle fat and the children growing, and the daily exchange of 2 people who had learned each other through the most literal patience, word by word and phrase by phrase. Lucy's English became, over the years, so natural and fluent that newcomers to Millhaven sometimes asked where she was from, catching the faint residue of her accent, and when she answered Romania, they looked at her with the particular surprise of people who had not expected that, and she would explain briefly and then move on because the explanation was not the important part. Ezekiel's Romanian, which had started as a handful of mispronounced words in a small notebook, became something real, something he could use not just for daily conversation, but for the complex exchanges of people who know each other well enough to argue in detail and make up in nuance. He was never without an accent, which Lucy maintained was terrible, which was an affectionate lie, because by 1880 his accent was merely noticeable rather than obstructive, and his vocabulary and grammar were solid in the way that things worked at until they are solid become solid. He still said "Bună dimineața" every morning. She still said it back. Some habits are not habits. Some habits are the form that love takes when it has had enough time to become architecture, to become the structure of daily life rather than the ornament of it. Joseph grew into a boy who moved between English and Romanian the way water moves between banks, effortlessly and without thinking about which side he was on, and who showed, very early, his father's deliberate, reading the horizon way of looking at the world and his mother's absolute refusal to be invisible. Alina grew into a girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's amber eyes, and the cheerful, fierce determination of someone who has two languages from birth, and understands from that fact alone that most barriers are only barriers until you find the words. The Blackwell Ranch in 1880 was a prosperous, well-run operation, and the Blackwell family was a real family, full of the particular richness that comes when people from different worlds have had the courage and the patience to learn each other all the way down. And on any given morning, if you stood outside the kitchen window of the main house and listened, you would hear the sound of it, the voices overlapping, English and Romanian and Spanish woven together into something that was not any one of those things but was all of them. The sound of a home that had been built word, by two people who had decided, in the face of every reason it might not work, that it would. In the autumn of 1880, Ezekiel Blackwell stood at the eastern fence in the evening light, the same fence where everything had first been spoken clearly, and waited for his wife to come out of the house. It was a habit now, the evening standing at the fence, a daily ritual they had kept through years of changing circumstances, because some things earned their permanence. Lucy came out of the house with her shawl around her shoulders and came to stand beside him, her arm touching his, her eyes going to the horizon with the same cataloging attention they had always had. "Tell me something in Romanian," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the last light moving across the autumn plain. "In Romanian," she said, "there is a word, door. It has no exact English translation. It means a kind of longing, but also a kind of fullness, a missing of something that you also already have. Like you can miss someone who is standing right next to you because you love them so much that even their presence is not entirely enough because you will always want more of them than is possible. That is a difficult feeling to hold," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it is also a beautiful one. Because it means you love something real, something worth missing." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel it now?" he asked. "Door." She looked at him with those amber eyes in the autumn light, clear and steady and warm. "Yes," she said, "always, for all of this." She looked at the land, the house, the light. "And for you?" He took her hand. "Te-iubesc," he said. "Te-iubesc," she said. The sun went the rest of the way down over the Blackwell Ranch in West Texas, painting the plain in long colors of gold and red, and the cattle settled into their evening sounds. And from the house came the voices of two children, and the clatter of Rose's kitchen, and the warm, abundant noise of everything that 4 months of ocean and a single wrong word, said with the right intention on a summer morning in 1874, had made possible.